It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Colleen M. Griffith is professor of the practice of theology at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. She also serves as faculty director of spirituality studies, and in that capacity, she has designed and now directs STM's summer postmaster certificate program in spiritual formation, now in its 21st year. Dr. Griffith holds a doctorate in theology from Harvard Divinity School, where she worked under the direction of the historical theologian Margaret Miles. Dr. Griffith works at the intersection of theology and spirituality, and her research and writing interests include historical and contemporary spirituality, Christian theologies of the body, method in practical theology, and exploration of the relationship between doctrine and spiritual practice. Colleen Griffith is a superb teacher and educator, indeed one of our best at STM. She's also a much sought-after lecturer. She's been the driving force behind the Evelyn Underhill Lecture in Christian Spirituality, an annual summer event at Boston College featuring distinguished scholars of spirituality since 2001. In addition to publishing many book chapters and essays, Dr. Griffith's text, Prophetic Witness, Women's Strategies for Reform, published by Crossroad, received a first-place award by the Catholic Press Association in 2010. She served as the editor for the C21 Resources magazine issue entitled Catholic Spirituality in Practice, which had an unprecedented print request of over 200,000 copies. That is a wow, yeah. Under Dr. Griffith's editorial guidance, this publication was expanded into the book Catholic Spiritual Practices, A Treasury Old and New, published by Paraclete Press in 2012, which to date has sold over 12,000 copies. A scholar of distinction, a creative educator, and a prophetic witness in her own right, Colleen Griffith is also a person who makes the practice of the faith a centerpiece of her generous work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Colleen Griffith, who will speak to us tonight on Spirit and Truth, No Alternative Facts.
Thank you, Dean Stegman, and thank you all for being here, given the night that's in it, huh? Well, in the fall of the year 2016, 2 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary declared post-truth to be its word of the year. The selection committee noted that there had been a 2,000% spike in usage of this term in 2016 over the previous year. In 2018, reference to a post-truth era has skyrocketed, and additional terms like fake news and alternative facts have been on the rise. Other phrases, too, have made their way into common usage, including the expressions fake science, as manufactured by deniers of climate change, fake history, as promoted by outlier revisionists, and fake followers and likes, as found in social media produced by bots. Most recently, the term truth decay has risen up as a description of the times, gaining considerable traction. Originally coined by the Rand Corporation, truth decay points in the direction of misleading facts and misinformation, the construction and peddling of falsehoods in our age, falsehoods and lack of truth-telling that are sadly evident in both church and state, and that contribute to a steady erosion of a shared sense of decency and integrity. Language both expresses and serves to constitute the worlds in which we find ourselves. And the new terms regarding truth and the present lack of truth-telling are no exceptions to this claim. To put it frankly, truth in the year 2018 is under siege. And when truth is under siege, there is a slow demise of time-honored ways of discerning truth as well. An observation made by Michiko Kakutani, Pulitzer Prize-winning literary critic and former chief book critic of the New York Times, who notes the following about our age, and I quote, "Reason is not only being undermined, but seems to have been tossed out the window, along with facts, informed debate, and deliberative policy making. Science is under attack, and so is expertise of every sort, be it expertise in foreign policy, national security, economics, or education. None of us, however unscathed we may profess to be by such things, has escaped the sad impact that this has had. There is no honest way to ignore the melancholy, the jadedness, the growing cynicism, and frustration that persons feel in response to attacks on truth and lack of truthfulness. These are real emotions, ones that threaten to hobble us if we fail to face and address them. They can drag down our souls and drain us of hope for the common good. They can rob us of our verve, rendering us numb and unresponsive. Feelings of frustration rise in people when commonly shared facts become what Kakatani terms fungible facts, or worse still, are replaced by partisan facts, underscoring tribal loyalty above all else. And cynicism grows when corruption has been allowed to undermine an honest gathering of facts and the sharing of truth in the first place. Sadness and anger deepen when usual processes of analysis, assessment, and review get the runaround, and trained experts posing significant and inconvenient questions are sidelined. When, for example, a congressional budget office functioning as an independent, nonpartisan entity that studies cost estimates of proposed legislation announces that a proposed health care bill will cause millions more people to be uninsured. And the result is attack on that agency itself, replete with new questions about whether its time of service has passed. What happens when the Sensus Sophiae, so I'm going to pronounce that correctly. Do we have any Latin folks here? Sensus Sophiae, the sense for wisdom in the people. The wisdom of the majority of people as a whole is ignored. When common sense policies like mandatory background checks on gun purchases, supported by 9 out of 10 Americans, or dreamers being allowed to stay in the country, supported by 87% of Americans, become points of rancorous debate. What happens when someone known for wanting to get rid of the Department of Energy becomes appointed to direct it, initiating cutbacks to renewable energy programs? Or when someone has sued the Environmental Protection Agency several times and becomes the leader of the EPA and begins to walk back legislation designed to protect the environment? What happens when a popular New York Monsignor rises to auxiliary bishop, and then bishop, onto archbishop, and then to cardinal archbishop, all the while having been accused of sexual misconduct with young seminarians who depended on his goodwill for their own advancement? What happens when a soured church diplomat, embittered by a demotion, attacks the good character and credibility of a pope in an attempt to frame a leader who has worked to restore the vision of reform as proposed by the Second Vatican Council? And what happens when trusted bodies like a free press, a justice system, intelligence agencies like the CIA, an electoral system, and well-meaning civil servants are scorned and demeaned? What happens? We all lose. The nation loses. The church loses. Hope for the common good loses. Today, truth and truth-telling tragically appear as endangered species, requiring sanctuary preserves and protection. Seeing truth on an endangered species list leaves many of us wondering how we possibly have gotten to this point. Have we missed danger flags, as Orwell called them in his classic text, 1984? Have we overlooked the changing of seasons and the approach of a cold winter? Lee McIntyre, author of the text Post-Truth, a 2018 MIT Press Essential Knowledge Series volume, claims that, quote, post-truth did not arise in the 1950s or even the 1960s. It awaited the perfect storm of a few other factors, like extreme partisan bias and social media silos that arose in the early 2000s. What have been contributing factors that have made it possible for us to not make truth a priority? McIntyre notes that in a recent Pew poll, 62% of U.S. adults reported getting their news from social media. He observes, and I quote, "This reflects a sea change in the source and composition of our news content." Without careful vetting of news sources, how do people figure out what stories are reliable, which are true? It can be challenging to discern what is a well-sourced fact, a well-sourced fact-driven claim, and what is not. Over 10 years ago, Silicon Valley entrepreneur Andrew Keen sounded an alarm bell, noting that the internet had not only democratized information, but was also, quote, dangerously blurring the lines between fact and opinion, informed argument and blustering speculation. How has this contributed to the siege on truth? One must consider, too, the odd media landscape that has become ours in recent decades and its effects. A proliferation of ideological media possibilities, right, left, and center, has created a kind of epistemic free-for-all in which the truth becomes a matter of viewpoint and agenda. A person can choose to watch Fox News each and every evening, and another can decide only to view MSNBC News nightly, and each will receive vastly different interpretations of the same events. Wherein lies the truth? Additionally, we ought consider the number of ways that people today are fed misinformation. Numerical misinformation, including misleading graphs and statistics offering distorted conclusions. Fictive elements in arguments which carry interest appeal but mislead. And science denial. The charge that climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese to ruin the American economy is a lie, plain and simple. In our time, global warming appears as the most glaring and pernicious case of science denial. In 2004, a lit review of 928 existing research papers on climate change indicated that none of the scientists disputed the reality of global warming. By 2012, with 13,950 papers supporting climate change as being of real concern, the number of dissenting views presented in scientific findings was 0.17%. A 2013 study of 4,000 research studies concluded that over 97% of climate scientists had voiced strong alarms regarding global warming, attributing it substantially to human activity. Sadly, according to a recent opinion poll reported by McIntyre in his 2018 publication, only 27% of American adults realize that climate scientists are in near unanimous agreement about the real threat that global warming poses and understand human behavior to be largely responsible for it. McIntyre comments, quote, "The public has been hoodwinked into thinking that there is a great scientific controversy over this issue." Science denial so often originates from economic interest. In a memo leaked from the proceedings of the American Petroleum Institute in 1998, in which major oil companies convened meetings to discuss industry responses to climate change and to the Kyoto Agreement, one finds the following, never intended for public consumption. The memo reads, I quote, "Victory will be achieved when," first bullet point, "average citizens, quote unquote, understand uncertainties in climate change. Recognition of uncertainties becomes part then of conventional wisdom." Bullet point number 2, media understands uncertainties in climate science. Next bullet point, media coverage reflects balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current wisdom. And final bullet point, industry senior leadership understands uncertainties in climate science, making them stronger ambassadors to those who shape climate policy. Are we interested in truth, or the creation and reception of facts that justify our corporate interests, our political points of view, our particular ideologies? This is a fair question in our time. George Orwell offers us a troubling reminder. He writes, "The most grossly obvious facts can be ignored when they are unwelcome." A further contributing factor to present that I think contributes to truth decay is the human proclivity toward bias. All of us seemingly suffer from this to some degree. McIntyre observes, one must always support the home team, right or wrong. New England fans truly cannot believe that the Patriots would be cheaters. Bias, left unchecked, will forever stand in the way of our willingness to consider facts and evidence. The most beneficial remedy for bias remains healthy dialogue, regular interaction with others of different persuasions, approached with epistemological humility and openness. Pope Francis, in his January 2018 message for World Communications Day, notes the following: "The best antidotes to falsehoods are not strategies, but people. People who make sincere dialogue so that the truth can emerge." Efforts made toward sincere dialogue will prove healing and productive. They will require, however, that we surround ourselves with more people than those of like-minded bias in order to make way for greater truth. Truth talk, writes theologian Catherine Keller, demands a self-questioning that opens us perilously to each other. There are times when core biblical texts rise to greet the inhabitants of specific historical periods and do so in almost haunting fashion. Such is the case, I believe, in the dramatic account of Jesus' exchange with Pilate regarding truth, found in the Passion narrative in John's Gospel. Here one finds an evocative exchange that begs contemplation in any ethos in which truth appears under siege. Relationship gets quickly established in this narrative between the storyteller, the evangelist, the representative of the Johannine community, and the audience, us, the readers, who become witnesses to an intense exchange that reaches a climactic point in chapter 18, verses 33 to 38. At first blush, the dialogue between protagonist and antagonist appears to be about the matter of kingship, as Pilate desires to probe this, eager to see what will be Jesus' claim. In actuality, this exchange is not about kingship at all, but about the reality of truth itself, and about there being an existing relationship between testifying to the truth and one's personal and communal identity. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate, governor of Judea, asks Jesus. Pilate has already had several clashes with the Jewish population, and his animosity toward them is well cemented. Yet he finds himself vulnerable to their intimidation, and is, as one biblical commentator notes, torn between his subjects and his Roman bosses. Pilate also knows that a claim of kingship, in a political sense here, would signal sedition. "Not in the way you think," answers Jesus. Quote, To this end I have been born, and to this end I come back into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. At this point in the drama, Pilate recognizes that Jesus isn't a political threat, and Jesus, who has highlighted his identity, purpose, and the nature of his community in his response, turns the tables here, putting testimony to the truth on trial and Pilate in a posture of defense. What is truth? Pilate taunts, his question rhetorical. After uttering it, he abruptly ends the conversation. Pilate, after all, is not on a truth-finding mission. He is deciding about his next politically expedient move. He neither recognizes the moment nor the truth embodied in the person of Jesus looking him in the eye. He proceeds to condemn a man he senses to be innocent and does so out of political pressure. Jesting Pilate. One cannot entirely disregard the question of truth, can one? The evangelist theologian staging the encounter between you and Jesus at the Roman Praetorium wove this question deliberately into your script for generations of future readers to witness and ponder in their respective contexts. How did this question become irrelevant for you? What emotion drives the dismissiveness in your voice as you utter it? Cynicism, perhaps? Jadedness? Suspicion? Or deep disdain born of long years of service to pragmatic politics? Such feelings are apparent in our present sociocultural milieu too. Is your question audible now? Who is raising it? Using what tone? Who's hearing it? Who's responding to it? Do we know our need for truth? Do we recognize our longing? The idea of truth has been approached from a variety of perspectives over time. Those subscribing to a correspondence theory seek a truth that matches up with facts and with the isness of reality. Persons favoring a coherence grasp of truth sense that whatever we claim is true belongs organically to whole systems or understandings of the world, and that the organic whole in which a claim sits matters and determines trueness. Pragmatists bring a further angle to the discussion, understanding claims to be true according to their ability to generate meaningful action. And what specific insight does the Christian tradition offer regarding truth? Christian faith adopts neither a correspondence, coherence, or pragmatist understanding of truth, charting quite a different course. Truth, from the standpoint of Christian faith, is not propositional. It is not about claims and their validity. In Christian faith, truth is person, the person of Christ. As such, truth points to the very selfhood of God as known by Jesus and made known to us through the Spirit. This truth cannot be positioned within our system of coordinates. It is neither subject to the whims or foibles of the world, nor dependent on its demands. It neither shivers in wintry seasons like our present one, nor abandons in times of siege. It is consoling and instructive that in the Hebrew Bible, the word truth conveys the sense of God's faithfulness. Human longing for this truth is a longing for union with God, the God of truth. The first followers of Christ didn't ask what his teachings were about or what moral code he followed. They asked him where he lived. In the words of commentator Robley Whitson, they came not to learn principles, but to learn Him, to learn of the living God, alive in human life, and to experience their own coming alive into this. In the process of coming alive themselves in Christ, Christians experience truth. Christian faith claims that we are not alone in our pursuit of this experiential truth. The Spirit is our guide. I will not leave you as orphans, John 14:18. In the giving of the Spirit, we witness Christ's interweaving of His life with the life of the Christian community. And through this giving of the Spirit, we are called into what theologian Elizabeth Johnson describes as, quote, loving immediacy with the mystery of God, who self-communicates to us in unspeakable nearness. The Apostle Paul communicated a strong sense of the Spirit. For him, the Spirit was something to be lived in and not manipulated. It was an experiential reality, an effective gift, whose reception was demonstrable. But the Spirit was always the grace given, the self-communication of God, and as such, it was neither capturable nor something that could be pinned down in human language. Paul wisely described the Spirit using plural reference that reflected different points of emphasis. Thus, he writes about the Spirit as one who leads, Romans 8:14, quickens, Romans 8:11, and reveals even the depths of God, 1 Corinthians 2, verse 10. He describes the Spirit as the activator of gifts, 1 Corinthians 12, 4-11, the one who bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, Romans 8:16, and the one given, through whom God's love has been poured into our hearts, Romans 5:5. For Paul, it is the Spirit that helps us in our weakness and intercedes with sighs too deep for words, Romans 8:26. In Pauline thought, the experience of the Spirit prompts a missioning involving a bearing witness to the truth. The Spirit, making possible the continuation of the presence and work of Jesus, binds us to one another, grounding ecclesial community. One central dwelling place of the Spirit of God is the human estate, in the very bodied selves of persons, and the ecclesial community, the body of Christ. Because of God's action and grace, human beings and communities of faith are able to sense within promptings, activities of God's Spirit, and to respond to them in freedom. The Spirit vivifies persons and communities, even and especially in wintry seasons, and draws them toward God's promised future. The vivifying activity of the Spirit, steadying us and drawing us toward a more truthful future, enables us to hope that bit more in the now, envisioning what truth might be able to come to pass because of the inbreaking of God, and acting in accord with this hope. Even in the stuffiest of surroundings, we are able to anticipate God's future by attending to the Spirit's lead. Christian spirituality urges a practice of discernment as an essential element of attending to the inbreaking of the truth. The purpose of discernment within the dynamics of a lively relationship with God is to critically reflect on personal and communal experience, and to do so in the context of prayer, in order to adjudicate wisely between choices of possible action. The need for discernment in the pursuit of truth is of great significance, as there so frequently are ambiguities apparent in our reading of present realities and our sense of what is being urged. We are not always adept at catching sight of operative assumptions that impact our interpreting, judging, and responding to a situation at hand. Good discernment makes it the more likely for us to move past limiting and illusory assumptions that bind and toward the creation of spaces of possibility where truth can grow, spaces that so often result in the fashioning of something in common rather than the protection of our own turf alone. Discernment fosters both a sense of what is and also what could be with shared vision and encouragement. Through opportunities for individual and communal discernment, persons are able to bring clearer eyes and more attuned ears to what ought to be of concern in the present, and are able to bear witness to the truth, the vocation to which we all have been called. And what do we sense to be the Spirit's draw in our time, particularly as we struggle with the eclipse of truth and truth-telling that has made for so much darkness? To what do we imagine ourselves invited as we long for the true? Are we challenged to reject dismissals of truth that persist, suggestions that truth is dead, that it doesn't exist anymore, that we live in a post-truth era? Are we called to be sharper reasoners, more critically aware, persons that can step back and evaluate facts at hand and form better evidence-based conclusions? Perhaps we feel called to flex our imaginations more in the accessing of realities not yet here, so that we can look beyond immediate situations to what John Sabrino calls the more in the real, for the sake of taking greater strides toward it. Or maybe we are being prodded toward greater epistemological humility, greater embrace of the one interior disposition so necessary for genuine dialogue to ensue. Is our next step one of standing silently with Pilate's question, what is truth, particularly in the face of this or that circumstance, or this or that relationship, and waiting in silence, not running from the question but listening, staying in the question without fear? It remains for each of us as individuals and communities of faith to discern next steps on the path to greater truth and truth-telling. The context in which life in the Spirit unfolds is historical and this worldly. Living in accord with the Spirit, therefore, cannot be separated from historical agency in the world, born of decisions to prioritize truth. For us as humans, truth will always be that wither of our deepest selves and the horizon beckoning to which we are journeying. Truth is such a holy reality. It demands much, challenging perspectives that are too narrow, frames of reference that require change, patterns of relationship that are incongruent, words that are not healing, and gestures that are not sincere. But it graces abundantly as well, nudging us steadily toward fuller communion with the God of truth, one another, and the created order. It has been said that lovers of God inevitably are lovers of truth, and that lovers of God worship in spirit and in truth. Together, and especially in our wintry season, may we be more committed lovers of the truth, discerning footpaths of passage in hard times, staying wide awake and hopeful, and enfleshing truth in whatever corners, nooks, and crannies of life we find ourselves in, that truth may continue in incarnate form, visible, enacted, bodied forth. Ultimately, it is by our truth that we will be known. Pilgrims, plotters, weary souls alike, who along with all flawed friends of God and prophets, seek mightily to communicate something of the peculiar beauty, goodness, and faithfulness of the God of truth. Thank you. Okay, at this point, we have some suggested questions for us to converse about together. It's been our pattern on these evenings to turn to 2 or 3 folks that are sitting next to us at this point and have a conversation. And if any of these questions whet your appetite, by all means pick up on the one that does. And if you have your own thoughts in response to the presentation, go that way as well. So our first question has been a winter season for truth in both church and country. What has been the effect of this on you? Christian faith understands truth to be person, namely the person of Christ. What are implications of this claim? What does the practice of discernment look like in your life and in that of your community of faith? And lastly, to what might the Spirit be inviting you in your journey toward greater truth? And what might that Spirit be inviting our communities of faith to at this time? Okay, so let's turn into brief groups of 3 and 4. Let's have good conversation. We'll take about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll be back to hear some of your good wisdom.
I don't always understand what I'm saying myself, but the second question is a
I
problem
don't think any of
for
us
me.
do all the time.
The second question is a problem for me because it says Christian faith understands truth to be the person, namely the person of Christ. And that isn't what is really true to me. There is a Holy Spirit that takes over and can do things. There is a God the Father who has a plan, and it is so much bigger than I can be. So if I limit myself to just Jesus, who was walking on for 3 years that I know about, I didn't know what was going on before, that I limit myself and I limit my fulfilling of what God might want of me. So each morning when I receive communion, I say, I don't know where you want me to go. One time I said to the Lord, when I was much younger, thank God, that I said, Lord, I had so many good plans to do today, and you kept getting in my way. And I didn't do any of the things that you told me. And that was the truth. And the Lord answered, and he said, you can fly, but the cocoon has got to go. So I said, that's a good idea. And so now I don't worry about all of this. I just receive communion and say, take me, use me, and let the whole thing go. And I go places that I would never expect. I don't know at 7 o'clock in the morning what I'm going to do at 9 o'clock. I may know, I have a plan, but it never works. So I think that, in a sense, I think that's a limitation by saying the person. And I made up a prayer many years ago, come Holy Spirit, enlighten me, so that I may walk in the footsteps of my brother Jesus, and so please my Father who is in heaven. And I think that the minute we die, we're going to see not how good we were, but the magnificentness of what God was able to use us for in completing his plan for the world.
Thank you for all of that, and especially for that very lovely Trinitarian prayer at the end. So when we're talking about the Christ reality, of course, we are referencing the Jesus of history and more, right? And more. Never to be separated, the Jesus of history, the Christ of faith, but definitely wider than the 33-year-old Jewish male that lived at a certain time, lived and walked the earth at that point. This sense of the person of Christ, our Trinitarian theology really assures us that we're talking about the very selfhood of God in that respect. And how do we know that? We know that through the gift of the Spirit, who reminds us of the wonderful ways and work of the Jesus who walked amongst us and certainly left us plenty of examples, and was a great bearer of the truth in his own life. And if we want to know what truth incarnate looks like, then Jesus stands as the parable of God with respect to that. And so we do look to Jesus for clues. I think the point of Christian faith, saying very strongly that truth for us is person, takes it out of the realm of all the big fights about propositions and laws and claims, and it really moves it into a whole other realm. And truth becomes something marvelously existential, relational, and I would say very Trinitarian in this kind of a claim. Yeah, thank you for that. Another comment, another question? Some of your good discussion that you had there? Yes, please.
Well, so we tackled, I think, the 4 questions. So it was an interesting conversation.
Great.
So yes, we feel like this crisis hurts,
Yeah.
and having to accept that at some point we're not going to be able to know the complete truth, and that's where faith comes in, and that's comforting, especially through Christ, right? And for us, we were talking about how this discernment and this invitation, in this journey towards this truth, it's an invitation about realizing that being well-intentioned is not enough these days. And I was sharing about this experience with a spiritual director who scolded me for having a 5-year-old spirituality. He always invited me to go further, to turn into a scientist if it was necessary, to being able to transmit this to especially to the youth, helping them realize that spirituality pays off, especially in the middle of this crisis where crime, where drugs, where the youth sometimes is losing their direction. Well, being able to give evidence-based dialogue based on love, based on compassion, we feel there are interesting answers there.
Okay, thank you for that. So it sounds like that was a wise spiritual director who urged you to think about truth in terms of your own existential reality, but also to look around and realize that there was more afoot than what immediately meets the eye, that there's a larger reality. There's a God of the future beckoning, and that God of the future that's beckoning does in fact rely on us by way of response, right? By way of response in this partnership. Yes, thank you for that. Other? Yes, please.
Hi, I would say that we took a mention of the second half of the first question as what has been the effect of this on you. And, well, we touched on some of the other points as well. At least 2 of the 4 people immediately said they feel overwhelmed. It is overwhelming to see so many fronts either collapsing or under attack, or the uncertainty, whether it's the political atmosphere or the church atmosphere. Personally, would be family as well, that there seems to be a desire in the world at large to kind of undermine all these things, and not just as you had mentioned, there used to be a time of just argument. You could have discussion and argument and certainly be, quite a lot in disagreement. But this is different from that. This idea that we once all knew the truth was here. You could argue about how you might want to get there, but we pretty much all agreed on what truth was. And the idea that is so undefinable, and I think there's this feeling of feeling overwhelmed and a sense of fear. I think we kind of express that, not understanding how this is going to get played out, certainly in younger people's lives and in future generations who maybe didn't even have the groundwork that we at least had, will know what we've lost, to not even grow up with that certainty. it's almost incomprehensible, really. So I think I think we all agreed we came here for you to tell us the answers because we could because we were good on the discussion, but not on conclusions about our towards the end, like kind of where do we go going forward.
Okay, and then we may have responses other than mine to this too, because it sounds like you'd like to hop in. I thank you. You said a lot there, the overwhelm and powerlessness in some respect that we feel. But I think we have to remember, and I look to Elizabeth Johnson for this, that, Ronner said firstly that there are wintry seasons of faith, and this is certainly a wintry season of faith. I would want to say it's a wintry season for truth. And in wintry seasons, we are not surrounded with the luxuriant trees that we love to walk amongst, walk through. And instead, we've got these bare branches, But in wintry seasons, you look through those bare branches and you see deeper into the woods. And there's a bigger perspective that comes to the fore that's very real. And having seen it, we can't sit on our duff quite as easily. It requires a good deal of courage, and it requires us to stand up and speak up and perhaps be more involved than we have to this point. You were going to add something there.
The thought that came to mind was how Jesus, in his public ministry, never shied away from public discourse, because this is really what we're talking about. My favorite story in the Bible is when Jesus confronts the crowd who is going to stone the woman who committed adultery. And for me, that was a very powerful scene. He didn't walk away. He spoke truth to both sides and invoked in the crowd their ability to focus and discern for themselves a choice. And then he also did that with the woman at the end of the conversation. So for me, and it has been for many months now, I belong to a Pax Christi group, that I feel that public discourse and the ability to make not an argument, like a thought contribution that allows people to speak and be heard and make choices that are better than what we're making now is really what we need to do.
Thanks for that. Great suggestion. And going back to our friend over here, connecting your comments, you voiced your overwhelm with others. I mean, the honest facing of what we're feeling and acknowledging that and not shoving that under the rug, but really realizing, I talked to my sister the other day and she said to me, I mean, where do we turn? Where do we turn? I mean, that honest admission of the level of feeling that's ours in this time is enormously important. We get nowhere without that, firstly. And then you discussed it with 3 or 4 others. Now, I think that discussion piece is really important, too, because we don't feel that alone, right? We feel that in common. The discernment piece in common is also really important. You talked about the importance of discernment in that scene. I think that we have great tools in the Christian tradition for doing discernment well as individuals. I don't see us doing a lot of it as communities of faith, which we desperately need to do at this time. But where and how does that happen? I like to say to the students at the STM when this kind of a question comes up, you folks in the chairs, you've got to create these places for such dialogue. You can't wait for permission to create dialogue with others, genuine human dialogue. But out of that great dialogue comes, I think, enormous creativity. And out of it, too, comes restoration and renewal. We're not alone in how we feel. But that discernment piece, which I found myself in writing this, just had to be pretty central in that second half. Otherwise, we just shout. We just shout what we've heard, what our tribe says, what we're expected to say. The discernment piece has to be a lifelong practice. And there's no bearing witness to the truth, which is our vocation, apart from discernment. That's a lifelong practice. Discernment, not just in terms of, what will I be when I grow up? I'm still asking that question now. But in what job will I have, 5 years out, 10 years out, et cetera? Well, but the kind of discernment that shapes our hearts is what we're talking about here, that readies us, that steadies us amidst these feelings that you're talking about, and that emboldens us, so that, in fact, in the middle of wherever you are, in the middle of that meeting, in the middle of that conversation with a spouse or significant other, that you actually become a voice of truth in that context. And that's who we're called to be. So, yes, another one over here, thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate all that you've said, and I appreciate the questions. What comes to my mind is Christ is bigger than himself. And the God of my understanding works everywhere. So, as they wanted an answer, the answer is in the leadership, and that's where the problem is, as far as I'm concerned. And you are a leader in that sense of uniting people. Like, I have a Muslim granddaughter who is fantastic. I have a Jewish wife who's fantastic. And that's what's needed, is joining together. Because Muslim people have a way of reaching God. Jewish people do. Hindus do. And until that coalesces, we're not going to see God as I see it. Thank you.
Great. And wherein lies leadership? Is it according to status, positions of power? I mean, what kind of leadership are we talking about here? And aren't we all called upon to step up in such a day? Uh-oh, the dean has a question.
No. First, a word of gratitude. That was a very learned discussion. I was impressed by all the research and reading you did, especially the analysis you gave the first half, and then I can also appreciate your work with the biblical texts, including my beloved Paul. So I'm definitely on board, but actually my question picks up. How does this presentation come into dialogue with those who do not believe in Christ or from different traditions, and how would, not just you, how would we respond to an assessment that, well, this is its own form of tribalism, this is the Christian tribalism take on truth? I don't think that is, but how would you respond to somebody who's saying, well, wait a minute, isn't this another form of tribalism?
Yes, yeah. Okay, he never asks an easy question. Never. In any context. I grant, and I grant that, I was speaking as a confessional Christian here in this. And I did it boldly because I don't feel we have exhausted the resources that are within our tradition that can really help us at this time. I don't know as much about other great world traditions, religious traditions, but undoubtedly each of these great religious traditions has something to say and offer us regarding truth. For tonight, though, I just would love us to fall back on amidst the overwhelm and the jadedness, and even we catch ourselves with some cynicism creeping up, to really look to the identity we claim, both personally and communally, and to find there anew some of the power that we proclaim, that has been allowed to be, I think, overrun, and it's become almost a subjugated knowledge, and yet there's tremendous power in it. So I'm not in a position to say with great specificity all that can come forward from other great religious traditions, and I'm certain that there's wonderful wisdom for us to tap there. But I do think that we, and not in our little silos and not as single individuals, need to together tap the resources that are in our Christian tradition presently at this time in a way that we haven't, and to keep raising the question about what it means to be this bearer of the truth. And if it is our vocation, to whom do we look with respect to that as confessional Christians? And what might we find in our scriptures, in our tradition, in one another, in fellow sister travelers, pilgrims, sloppers along in the mud, all of us, really. Yes, Jen.
So as you're talking and responding to the Dean's question, I'm feeling grateful for the invitation to go further into my relationship with Christ, to recover those resources, and then also to recognize that when I do that, Christ calls me out of tribalism. That in order to follow Christ, in order to go deeper into my own faith, I can't, I don't know, I haven't thought this through, but I can't pull the church around me as a tribe. I have to go out, as Pope Francis indicates. So.
Thank you. Okay, and perhaps a last comment or question?
Would it be wrong to, when dealing with other religions, even atheists, to think of it not as the truth, but as good, the good? Because we all have the same morality. Even an atheist would agree to the same morality. So if you are talking about the good instead of the truth, that might be more helpful to all.
And I would venture to say that we don't need to leave the word truth. I mean, let's consider truth. Let's not move off that dime, because this is what we need more than anything today, is much more substantive discussion, movement toward greater levels of it, right? So let's see what we hold in common regarding that word and that search. And certainly the longing that I spoke of, that longing for the truth, which, when I interrogated Pilate in the talk, those questions were very real for me in terms of how it was almost frightening, how and when he could become that dismissive of that question. When did it become an irrelevant question? And I suppose I fear that in our time, in a big way. When did it become an irrelevant question? And what led to that? Because if and when that question gets raised, and we don't run from it, and we raise it in other than rhetorical fashion, I think that we come into contact with our own longing in a really pronounced way. Whether we're Christian, Jew, Muslim, whether we're Hindu, whatever religion we profess, when we ask that question, what is truth, and stay there, I think the human longing for the truth, which is larger than and expressed in so many of the great religious traditions of the world. I think we know our own longing. And knowing that own longing is what will push us forward. Thanks everybody. It's been a great night, and I really appreciate that you came out in terrible weather. And I just encourage you to enjoy the rest of the food and continue conversing with your friends who are here. Thank you.